metropolitan, in the tri-state area, we are dealing with not only old system, many parts of our system in the region are over 100 years old, and two, the impact of climate change. Because for specifically many of the commuter trains that are coming in and out of New Jersey to New York, they are suffering from really overheated infrastructure. The overhead wires that power some of the commuter rail lines, they tend to sag in the summertime due to extreme heat. There are also parts of the system in the region that the tracks, the joints of the tracks freeze and lock and need to be fixed manually. And so that means sending a crew out and literally chipping away at ice. And so that leads to other delays. And then there's flooding that happens sometimes on a sunny day in different parts of the system. And so those are the things that are compounding the experiences we're having due to old infrastructure.
The 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast explores neighborhood design and urban policy topics through the critical lens of equity to give listeners the tools needed to overcome structural and institutional barriers, and examines how the built environment shapes communities for better or worse. Tune in once a month to keep it 4 degrees to the streets. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast. We are rocking and rolling through season 5. We are moving very quickly. I'm super excited to introduce today's guest and get into today's conversation. I'm going to be interviewing Tiffany-Ann Taylor. She's the Vice President of Transportation at the Regional Plan Association out in the New York Metropolitan area. I'll give you guys a reminder to listen to my previous episode with Jamae Coleman. We did an episode on equity in the government procurement process, and there's a lot of information in there for my small businesses on ways you can become a local, state, or federal contractor with the government. So please tap into that episode. And since I'm having a conversation with Tiffany, and we're going to be talking about New York and the New York area, I thought about, well, you guys know I'm from Jersey, but I thought about my favorite shows that kind of take place in New York, and Living Single and Sex and the City come to mind. And those shows are very different, like the cast, probably the target audience, and I think they were definitely on different networks. But I love both of them because the city of New York is a character in the show, just as much as all the other stars are. And it's also a group cast, which I really like. The thing I think is most interesting about that show and about the fact that they were both in the same city is that the worlds that the characters live in and operate within are totally different. Living Single was set in Brooklyn, and they rarely go into or even really discuss Manhattan. And then in Sex and the City, those girls are Manhattan through and through. I don't even know if they ever went past Central Park in Sex and the City. But I remember the episode in Sex and the City when I think it was Miranda was like gonna buy a house in Brooklyn, or maybe get like a bigger apartment in Brooklyn. And she tries to get a cab in her neighborhood, and the cab driver's like, I don't go to Brooklyn. And so that's just real indicative of the way that the city was characterized on television in like the late 90s, early 2000s. And I was thinking of that as I was preparing for this episode. So today we're going to be talking about congestion pricing, and I'm going to be having an interview with Tiffany-Ann Taylor, again, the Vice President for Transportation at the Regional Plan Association. New York City is a population of about 8.2 million people. That does not include like the larger MSA of New Jersey and Connecticut and even parts of Pennsylvania in some regards. And so I know we have listeners in the New York City area, so this episode is for y'all. And I'm just going to give a quick background on congestion pricing to my knowledge before jumping into the interview questions with Tiffany. And so congestion pricing, basically and simply, is a charge for using a service that has a lot of demand. In New York, congestion pricing would involve charging drivers a fee for entering Manhattan below 60th Street. The goal of congestion pricing in New York is to reduce traffic and congestion, along with the associated air pollution, while providing funding to transit. Average speeds in lower Manhattan are below or average around 5 to 7 miles per hour, especially during rush hour, with nearly a million vehicles entering that area daily. And so congestion pricing is designed to shift travelers from their personal vehicles to transit, which would have a massive improvement on air quality, among other things. And so, cars and trucks, as if you guys remember from our previous episodes, are the largest contributors of pollutants like particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and other greenhouse gas emissions. And so, it's a really important kind of policy that influences the environment and social conditions. In New York, the policy has been discussed for several decades, and it finally got legs during the current governor's term in 2021. In the summer of 2024, congestion pricing was set to begin below 60th Street in Manhattan, with the tolling facilities, like the cameras and the meters, already installed. A few weeks before the tolling would begin, Governor Hochul paused the program, stating that the charge would add a burden on families and hurt the city's recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. In November 2024, the governor held a press conference unpausing the tolling. At that time, tolling was set to begin in January of 2025 at a much lower fee of $9 compared to the $15 that was previously planned. Today, I'm speaking with Tiffany-Ann Taylor about urban planning and issues happening in New York City. I'm going to read Tiffany's bio before jumping into the interview. Tiffany-Ann Taylor is the Vice President for Transportation at the Regional Plan Association, or RPA. Prior to working at RPA, she served as the Deputy Director for Freight Programs, Education, and Research for the Freight Mobility Unit at the New York City Department of Transportation, and as an Assistant Vice President at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. During her time in New York City government, Tiffany led transformative passenger transportation projects, freight policy, and truck safety and compliance initiatives. Prior to her time with the city, Tiffany focused on suburban and regional planning efforts while working for the Suffolk County Department of Economic Development and Planning on Long Island, where her primary projects were centered on passenger transportation, open space, and economic development. She holds a BA in government from the College of William and Mary and a master's in science in city and regional planning from Pratt Institute. Tiffany is a first generation American, the brainchild of the Hindsight Conference, and former president of the New York Metro chapter of the American Planning Association. Tiffany is an alum of the Choral Leadership New York program, the Urban Design Forum's Forefront Fellowship Program, the NYU Rudin Center Emerging Leaders in Transportation Fellowship Program, and is a former mentor for the Transit Center's Women Changing Transportation Mentorship Program. Tiffany, thank you so much for being on the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
I just read your bio. I think I listed every single top planning entity or organization that exists in the New York metropolitan area in your bio. So please tell us some things that's not in your bio. Why did you choose urban planning as your profession? What makes you excited about transportation planning in particular?
Sure. What are some of the things that are not in my bio? Well, I did not get a job immediately out of school. I actually was unemployed for 3 years because I was doing graduate school during the 2008 recession, and so that was a hard time. So I definitely want to remind your listeners that if this is a familiar story, delayed does not mean denied. And you can go on from there. I also didn't get into planning school immediately. So when I originally applied, I applied to 4 schools in our area, including Pratt, and I was rejected from all of them except Pratt, but Pratt waitlisted me. And about 30 days before the semester started, they took me off the wait list and admitted me. And again, it's funny because I'm now probably the program's most notable alumni right now. I'm a visiting professor there, and I'm also about to be a visiting professor for the spring semester at NYU, which is one of the schools that originally denied me. So I just like to remind folks, no matter what age, just be persistent. Sometimes it's about timing. So why did I choose the profession? I think actually the profession chose me, to be honest with you. As you read in my bio, I am a first generation child of immigrants. My family is from Jamaica, and I think the idea of living and seeing the world through two lenses, one as a child of immigrants, one as someone who was born in this country, I naturally gravitate to what mobility means, how do people get around. I think I come to things with more of a global lens because that's how I was raised, right? Or at least the view of what it means to live life in America. I'm originally in the beginning looking at it from the view of my immigrant parents. I'm from Long Island, New York, which is, as you read, a place where I also worked earlier on in my career. But I mentioned that because it's also the birthplace of suburbia. Levittown, New York, is about maybe 30 minutes away from where I grew up and where my parents still live part-time today. And for many of your listeners, they're going to be familiar with a name, Robert Moses. My town is two towns over from where he was from, and there is a life-size bronze statue of him that exists today. I promise you can Google it. And so it's interesting that I grew up in this space and what he has done to this part of the world, his impact on the profession. No matter how much you slice it, there has been an impact. And so you would think that I would naturally end up in this space. And I think ultimately, the way that I was raised and my sister was raised, we always wanted to work in professions where I think, really give back and contribute to society in some way. And so I think transportation, they call it the great equalizer, right? Because regardless of the amount of money you make, you have to think about where you're going and how you're going to get there. And so I think if you mix all of those things together, that naturally puts me into transportation planning and policy.
You sharing this story about not getting into the 4 schools in your area reminds me of that Beyoncé song when she's like, I don't know exactly the song, but in the video, she's like, the guy rejected her to go to prom or something. And
Yes,
that's
yes,
exactly what it is. Especially when you said, I'm like their most notable alumni. I'm like, yeah, to let you in from
yes.
the beginning. No, I think that's wonderful. And yeah, for sure. I've read The Power Broker about Robert Moses several times. And so I can imagine what it is like to grow up on Long Island, a place where he had such a huge impact. I think it would have been
hmm
hard for you not to be not to be a planner in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because despite that, I actually didn't have planning vocabulary. Where I grew up was a predominantly white neighborhood, even though my school district was more of an ethnically diverse neighborhood over time. It wasn't until I went to school in Virginia, as a matter of fact, my last semester of school, I took a class on urban sociology, and that is when I was actually introduced to the language of urban planning. And what does it mean for a city to grow or a city to die? What are, waves of movement? What is white flight? What are, all of the greats, so to speak, that we hear about in our profession that have given us this canon of information and language, Le Corbusier, and however you want to, slice it. I wasn't introduced to that until I was in college in a whole other state. And that exposure made me realize, oh, where I live is actually a part of history in a lot of ways. And so perhaps because of that, my environment actually like filled or sparked a curiosity for me about transportation and mobility.
I appreciate you sharing that story because I think that's a very relatable perspective, especially for a lot of people of color that go to school. And realize later on in school, maybe it's like when they take a class, to your point, or it's the last semester, and they're like, oh, this is planning. You've been exposed to
hmm
certain aspects of it, right, throughout your life, whether you're riding the train or seeing an apartment being built or watching a forest land turning into a subdivision. So like you've been
hmm
exposed to planning all your life. We all have, but never really had a name for it until
Right.
often you go to school. And so I think that's exactly my story also, is I didn't know what exactly planning was. I had seen all these things change in my suburban neighborhood. And in a different way, I grew up in the suburbs with my grandparents, and then my mother lived in the city. And so I
hmm
would go to the city in the weekends and be like, how come there's all these liquor stores and I don't have all those liquor stores? Or how come my mom says I can't go to the park when I go to the park
hmm
all the time at my grandparents' house? Um, And it wasn't until I got to undergrad where I was thinking I was going to have a different major, a different social science major, but still a social science major, that I realized, oh, the planning is what it is. Like the physical aspect of it is like really what it is.
Yeah, completely agree. And that's a very common story. Many people of color who ultimately enter planning, we hear about it much later in life to compare to our white counterparts. And I think also largely, as you were kind of alluding to, it's because many of us have also experienced harm because of planning, and much of that is generational harm. And so it's also pushes us away from even wanting to learn more about that profession.
We have a lot of listeners tuning in from markets outside of the New York City area. For those who are not familiar, please describe the mission and purpose of the Regional Plan Association. And if you can, highlight a few of you guys' recent successes.
Sure, absolutely. So the Regional Plan Association is actually a very old organization. We are 102 years old. We are a civic nonprofit that's engaged in ensuring a better quality of life for the tri-state area. For us, the definition of tri-state area is largely New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And so we are both a research and advocacy focused organization. We are very well known for our original research, and then we take that research to support our advocacy campaigns. About once every 25 years, we release something called a regional plan. So there have been four regional plans. The most recent one was released in 2017, and it's a big book. And so I mention that because that book is essentially our guiding document. It tells us, hey, if we look ahead to the next 25 years, what do we need to do in transportation, housing and community development, energy and environment? What do we need to do to get to a better place and ensure a sustainable and productive region? For me, directly, as Vice President of Transportation, I often tell people that if it moves people or goods within the region, I have to have an opinion on it, and that's true. Every day for me is very different. You probably won't believe me, but last week I was talking to a government agency about drone infrastructure and sustainable fuels. Yesterday, at a press conference about congestion pricing. Earlier in the week, I was talking to somebody about dredging, which has to do with making a waterway deeper so that larger container ships can come into the New York Harbor. We support, more bus service and better advocacy for vulnerable road users. So you name it, if it moves, we think about it and we talk about it.
I like that. That is a very, very wide range. So I'm glad that you
Yes.
guys get to keep it spicy.
Yeah.
Um, on transportation a little further, what are the travel patterns in Lower Manhattan or Manhattan specifically today? Do you have a sense of how many people are traveling into the area on average daily? The kind of methods, whether they're using bikes, cars, personal vehicles, Uber, taxi, and
Mhm.
then how do those numbers compare to the pre-pandemic and post-pandemic kind of periods?
Yeah. So by and large, people are still mostly coming into, well, I guess what we would call the central business district, which is really Manhattan, by public transportation. That really hasn't changed, absolutely compared to pre-pandemic levels, which really 2019 would be the most recent year, for more complete data. It has reduced on certain modes, but we have definitely seen an uptick, definitely more of an uptick on commuter rail. Definitely bus service and subway has increased as well. Um, Folks still drive in. That really hasn't changed too much. Well, actually, that's not true. Folks still drive in. There's still for hire vehicles, and for your listeners who are not as familiar, for hire vehicle, or also known as an FHV, are the app-based services. So Uber, Lyft, not giving any corporate sponsorship, but just giving as an example. Those numbers were really at their peak in terms of use in 2019, and those numbers have come down. We still have yellow cab taxis, we still have green cab taxis, and green taxis are actually those that have a selective part of the city that they're allowed to operate. And private vehicles still exist as well. So the travel patterns remain the same. I would also include the increased popularity of micromobility. And so largely, micromobility includes things like electric scooters, electric bikes, or e-bikes. And so pre-pandemic, things like e-bikes were actually not legal in New York. They were around, but they technically weren't legal. During the pandemic, due to an emergency order from the governor at the time, the definition of e-bikes has been updated and the legality of them was permitted. And so now you see much more of them on the streets. It's not just delivery workers using them for commercial use, but also the average commuter getting around town. And even the city itself, New York City as an agent, has also created and promoted micromobility programs. So there are e-scooters and e-bike programs. Folks who have been here are familiar with City Bike. That is our most popular bike share program. It also has a version of e-bikes, which is really pedal assist. They're not using bikes that have a motor or a throttle. So the landscape has changed, but for the most part, people are still getting around the way that they were before, but just at different rates.
And how are how is the region projecting travel patterns to change with congestion pricing implemented?
Yeah. So that's a big question. The idea, as you mentioned earlier, is to encourage disincentivize driving and to encourage folks to use public transportation. What's really important for that is that the revenue for congestion pricing is actually going to go to MTA's capital budget. So for a little bit of explanation, there's an operational budget for the agency and a capital budget. The operational budget is, where most of your revenue comes from. If you're paying a fee or swiping your Metro card or your Omni card, it goes to, salaries of workers every day. That's the operations to help the system run. The money for congestion pricing is dedicated by the legislation to only go to capital planning. And so what is that? That's building new subway stations, that's buying new buses, that's upgrading bus depots, that's incorporating elevators and increasing ADA accessibility at stations. And so the idea is that if we're changing behavior by disincentivizing folks from driving, passengers anyway, then we can invest in the system with dedicated revenue. It does also on the freight side, because it doesn't get as much of attention, but I'm sure your audience would want to hear that perspective anyway. It should also make freight deliveries easier and in theory safer if there's less conflict with passenger vehicles on the road, or less opportunity rather for conflict with passenger vehicles on the road. It should help reduce, truck emissions in the air because they're not idling looking for parking, they're not circling, they're not sitting in traffic. There also is an overnight reduction in price for a certain set of hours. So for deliveries to happen overnight, there is also to incentivize them rather. There's also a city-led program called Off Hour Deliveries Program, which also provides financial incentives to encourage businesses to make deliveries in the off-peak hours, again, for those same reasons. So yes, the idea from the passenger perspective is to encourage more trips to be made on public transportation, and for on the freight perspective to either reduce the truck time and traffic, or at least incentivize businesses to do their business in the off-peak hours.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I'm thinking about it was interesting when you mentioned that the Lyft, Uber, like let's call it the for hire vehicles, has declined since pre-pandemic.
Mhm.
I'm curious about, I just have to think more intuitively about like the rationale between that, but that's an interesting fact about the travel patterns.
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with the fact that it just became a finite thing, right? It can't really grow exponentially. There was also a period of time where the mayor at the time did try to put a cap on the number of drivers that were allowed to participate in the program. That peak happened, and then we went into a pandemic, right? And so folks literally were not going anywhere. And so some drivers unfortunately may have passed on. There are just other instances. And then also are for some sectors of employment, their working commute and travel patterns have changed, right? Like more people have in the sectors that can, right? Because you can't fill a pothole from your couch at home. But in the sectors that you can, they're maybe working hybrid, so like they're only traveling to work a few times a week, or maybe they are even fully remote. And so, proportionally, the amount of drivers that were perhaps driving for those companies have started to disappear. So we're on the smaller end now.
That makes sense. Um, I was in undergrad when I first heard of congestion pricing for New York City. That was about 8 or 10 years ago. And so, what is kind of the history of congestion pricing in New York? When was the policy kind of first introduced, and how did people respond to it? And are there, prior to this version of the program, were there other kind of demand fees or things like that for the region?
Sure. So I have a whole 37 slide presentation about the answer to this question. I'm joking about that. I've presented on it. So congestion pricing has seen its time in the media quite a few times in New York City history. You could even argue that in some of RPA's earlier regional plans that it released, that we were talking about the idea of essentially drawing a circle around Manhattan as a central business district and charging people to enter into and out of it. But more formally, I would say that the idea goes back to the 90s. So you're talking at least 30 years ago. And so it's looked a couple of different ways. Then I would say the peak of really when it came into fruition is the summer of 2017. So really the summers 2017 to 2019. And I'll try to briefly explain why. So the summer of 2019 is actually known in New York City transportation history as the summer of hell. I am not making that up. I am not being crass. That is what the media dubbed it, and let me explain why. There were quite a few things happening at this time. So New York City has gone through different periods over time, probably most famously the 1970s, where there has been disinvestment in the public transportation system, but in the 90s, sorry, in the 70s, I think is where it is most commonly remembered as being at its lowest point. But I mention that because since then there have been periods up and down again where the MTA has struggled to find dedicated funding, and so that means you have to delay basically anything that's out of a constant state of good repair for the system, right? And so you're kind of pushing off things like buying new infrastructure, pushing off things like upgrading, system signals, et cetera, et cetera. The summer of 2017, that came to a peak. If you were in New York City and riding the subway in the summer of 2017, you remember you were probably going to be delayed on a train at some point in time. We had trains getting stuck where there was no air conditioning, people getting delays because a train broke down or the signal service system wasn't working properly. You also had in neighboring states, so into and out of New Jersey through Penn Station, you had a train derailment, you had a train jump the tracks, you had also on the street side. Remember, we just said that in 2019, that was also peak usage for for-hire vehicles, so you had more congested streets at that time. In 2019. I was also working for City DOT at that time in freight. And that at that point in history was the year where we saw the highest crashes or fatalities due to trucks and large vehicles coming into contact with cyclists. There was actually a whole report put out that year, the Green Wave Report, which was the city's attempt to try and negate that or prevent that from happening at that time. So I say all this because there was quite a few things happening in the transportation and mobility space, and really and truly, people were fed up with it. And they said, what are we going to do? Because this city's lifeblood is tied to the health and strength of its public transportation system, right? It's 24/7 system. It takes us where we need to go all the time. And so there were different um, players at that time, so I won't bore you with those details, but ultimately, congestion pricing legislation made it to state legislature in 2019, and essentially two things were signed that turned into law. So to answer the other part of your question is one of those things was that taxis and for hire vehicles would pay a separate congestion charge because remember at that time there was peak usage of for hire vehicles. And so I believe it was either $2.50 or $2.75. I think it was 250. That is even today already calculated. If you open your Uber app, if you open your Lyft app, it says congestion charge. That is a separate pot that has been running uninterrupted this entire time. And then the second thing that happened is the Traffic Mobility Review Act, which I think is its formal name, aka congestion pricing. And that's the big piece of transportation policy that we're talking about today.
Yeah, I remember riding the train that summer and definitely got stuck a few times trying to get out of New Jersey into Penn Station.
Hmm.
And I haven't ridden the train since I've been in LA, which we can talk about differently. But from my understanding, and we'll definitely get to the Gateway Project at the end of towards the end of this conversation, but are we still in a summer of hell or were we in a fall of hell? Because I'm seeing a lot of slowdowns. I'm seeing a lot of people on TikTok stuck in Hoboken having to get off the train in Jersey City or
Yeah.
Secaucus or something like that.
Yeah. So we're not in the summer or fall of hell, but it's in our best interest not to let it get that bad, right? And part of the thing that's also missing from, this part of the conversation is that congestion pricing by law was actually supposed to turn on in 2020, but obviously we had a pandemic. So there's this huge delay in the implementation of that program. And then there was also that means pushing out a delay in the next capital program as planning for that as well. So we're not officially in a season of hell, I would say. But there's definitely challenges. I think one of the challenges that makes the experience feel hellish is that unfortunately in this region, it's not exclusive to this country, but for this conversation, in the tri-state area, we are dealing with not only old system, many parts of our system in the region are over 100 years old, and two, the impact of climate change because for specifically many of the commuter trains that are coming in and out of New York, in and out of New Jersey to New York, they are suffering from, especially during the summer, really overheated infrastructure, in which not trying not to get too technical, some of the catenary wires, which are the overhead wires that power some of the commuter rail lines, they tend to sag in the summertime due to extreme heat. There are also parts of the system in the region that the joints of the tracks freeze and lock and need to be fixed manually. And so that means sending a crew out and literally chipping away at ice. And so that leads to other delays. So, and then there's flooding that happens sometimes on a sunny day, in different parts of the system, right? And so those are the things that are compounding, the experiences we're having due to old infrastructure.
Thank you so much for getting into the technical and the nitty-gritty because our listeners will appreciate it. I'd certainly appreciate it
Good,
also.
good.
Um, I knew that the climate change was having an impact, but it's important. What I mean by thanks for getting into the nitty-gritty is because I think people say climate change is impacting infrastructure and we just end it there and we don't
Hmm.
necessarily, and people are like, okay, climate change is impacting everything. Like people just think that passing over. And it's like, no, let's talk about exactly like weather and the
Hmm.
environment have impacts on like physical things. Like
Yeah.
it's going to expand, it's going to shrink, it's going to freeze, it's going to
Hmm.
ice, it's going to sag. And this is what that means. So I really do appreciate that. The benefits of congestion pricing we've kind of talked about a lot, but I'll just list them quickly, particularly as I see them and as I've read about them. Improved air quality, easier access for fire and EMT services to reach those in need, revenue for transit services, and a whole lot more. I'm sure improved pedestrian safety is also one of them. Can
Hmm.
you speak to that point, how the non-motorized user, the pedestrian, the cyclist, the scooterist stand to benefit from congestion pricing? Like, what is the state of the pedestrian environment in Lower Manhattan? Understanding that it's a gridlock and it's congested, are there a lot of pedestrian fatalities? Is it generally a safe environment for pedestrians? And then with the policy implemented, should we expect to see some kind of like street level changes, maybe a widening of the sidewalks
Hmm.
or more pedestrian level plots, pedestrian only plazas, bus rapid transit lanes, anything like that?
Yeah, so the answer to all of that is yes, to be honest with you. So I'll try and slice it a couple of different ways so we can all, as an audience, digest it a little bit better. So first thing, what is the benefit to the pedestrian, the cyclist, perhaps the non vehicular commuter, so to speak? So there should be some direct and indirect. So one of the direct would be technically, right, if there are less cars on the street because there is less of an incentive to drive, there should be less of an opportunity for, crashes and interactions with vehicles. There is simultaneously a streets comprehensive plan. It used to be known as the Streets Master Plan, but forgive me, I forgot what city DOT has renamed it. But there is a comprehensive plan that is out and mandated by law that's to be implemented, and many of the improvements in that are to be implemented complementary to the implementation of congestion pricing. So that does include things like upgrades to certain sidewalks or changing the distance between certain crossings, improving, things like speed bumps or different dangerous intersections, implementing more protected bike lanes, implementing more dedicated bus lanes, et cetera, et cetera. And that has been admittedly a very slow go, as you can imagine, some of the politics required to actually implement that. But the plan exists nonetheless, and it's moving slowly. Also, directly for those who are using the public transportation system, they will see the direct benefit, right? They will see station expansion. They will see more accessible subway stations rather. For your listeners who are not as familiar, the New York City subway system has well over 400 stations. I think it's like 425 or something like that. Only about a quarter of those stations today are fully accessible. So that means they're actually not accessible, right? And so dedicated money from something like congestion pricing could help get us closer to 100%. It's going to take some time, but it'll help get us closer. We would also see more efficient train service and a more frequency, because one of the things that congestion pricing would do is provide money for system upgrades to upgrade a system called CBTC, which forgive me what it stands for at the moment, but basically it's the signaling system that tells trains where they need to be, and where they shouldn't be. And so obviously if you can see that better and control that more electronically and safely, that means a more efficient system for all. Yes, other things like more pedestrian plazas, those are tapped as part of the larger comprehensive plan that I mentioned as well. And again, implementing more dedicated lanes for buses. In New York City, we don't have BRT specifically. We have what I call BRT Light, which is Select Bus Service or SBS, but it has many of the same features as traditional BRT, including, as you're mentioning, a dedicated lane, sometimes transit signal priority, right, where the filter light changes green for the bus slightly ahead of traditional traffic for it to cross. And it does have ticketing that happens on the sidewalk. So you buy your ticket before you get on, instead of paying the fare on the bus, which tends to slow down buses on its route. So there are a lot of direct and indirect benefits, and then also improved air. So if we're having less vehicles on the road, that should over time positively impact the quality of our air as well, and that's a benefit for everybody.
Thank you for highlighting those. Yeah, the air quality, critical important. If anyone's ever taken a jog on a street that is congested, you are every time I see someone running and they're running on the sidewalk in bumper to bumper traffic, I'm like, oh, their poor lungs. Like
Mm-hmm.
all of the fumes, all of the things are just being inhaled at this time.
Mm-hmm.
New York joins London, which has a population of about 8.8 million people, and Singapore, which has a population of about 6 million people, as cities with existing congesting pricing programs. That's really great company to be within.
Mm-hmm.
How significant is it for New York City to be the first city in the US to implement congesting pricing? Are there any other ways in which we've done things in New York from an urban planning or policy perspective that we've been, or that the city's been a leader for other American cities?
Absolutely. So it's huge to be in their company. I will tell you, when the announcement happened earlier this year that congestion pricing would move forward after all the public testimony and the MTA board voted, we saw other cities in the country already start to, make moves to figure out what it could look like where they are. So I believe a city in California, I think it was LA at the time, and I think also Boston was also taking a look to see, well, what would it mean for us and where would we draw that? Even the city of Toronto, I was actually invited to speak to the Regional Board of Trade there earlier this year because they had had previous conversations about congestion pricing years ago. And now it seems like, given the way that their economic development is changing and they're investing more in their public transportation system, it seems like it might be a good opportunity to bring the idea back. So definitely the world is watching New York City and watching this region. And there's great examples. We actually just mentioned it in the answer to the last question, which is the pedestrianization of many parts of it. So really turning major pieces of city infrastructure into pedestrian plazas. So Times Square is the marquee example. So back then, under former City DOT Commissioner Jeanette Sadik Khan, she is definitely looked at as someone who pushed forth this idea of what if we really do prioritize people rather than cars for streets. And so she and her team there at the time, shut traffic down. And it was a fight. I think her book is actually about the fight, quite honestly, in that we're reducing lanes because the idea is that if you reduce the lanes of traffic, it essentially disappears, quote unquote. And by disappear, we mean either people don't take that trip by car anymore, or they find an alternate route elsewhere. And so that's what we want. And when you reclaim that space, there's an opportunity to reprogram it for the pedestrian, for the cyclist. We can also look to London for that example. You'll often hear people say, well, congestion pricing didn't work in London. It's still expensive and it's still slow to move around. Well, it's expensive because it's a dynamic pricing system, or at least their system moves up and down. And also, yes, traffic moves slower because after they implemented congestion pricing, there was physically more space that could be taken away from vehicles to dedicate for other uses. So they use that opportunity to upgrade and expand their bus network and their cycling network, right? And so you have now more opportunity for a complete street or a more democratized street such that more than one mode can use the same piece of infrastructure.
We love complete streets. I love a
Yeah,
complete street. I love the
yeah.
graphics of like the before street and after street, and especially looking at Times Square. I remember Times Square before the
Hmm.
pedestrianization and after, and I don't think I was old enough to like participate in the discourse around the fight for the pedestrianization,
Hmm.
but I can only imagine. I mean, the number of the I can just see how businesses and advertisers would think that was like the worst idea ever, and it
Hmm.
has been the best thing to happen to Manhattan in deck. Like that is amazing to have that there.
Absolutely. And now what you see is other cities, small, big, it doesn't matter. They have taken that from the New York City playbook because it's something that doesn't have to start out as a capital project. It literally starts as paint on the street. I mean, even dedicated bus lanes, if you think about it, it's literally a lane of traffic that's painted a different color with some signs. That's it. You haven't built anything, you haven't poured any concrete. And then, of course, there's enforcement related to that. And so now it's something that I think many transportation agencies across the country, for sure, because they've been already doing it in other parts of the world, have looked to New York City for that type of guidance and that type of leadership.
There's criticism that New Jersey commuters will be paying the toll, right, and aiding to fund these capital improvements, but
Mhm.
that their communities won't receive any benefit if it's a MTA capital improvement. Recognizing that RPA's region is New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, can you speak to the transit and kind of general transportation planning efforts that are happening at the regional scale to kind of
Mhm.
improve regional transportation?
Yeah, I think I want to turn that question on its head a little bit, or rather the answer to the question on its head a little bit. Because I think when folks see the idea of a congestion pricing fee, they think that it's a punitive toll. But let's actually take a snapshot of what it looks like today, and then we can talk fairness. So if you picture Manhattan and you picture all the crossings into it on the east and the west side. So for the listeners, on the west side of Manhattan, across the river is New Jersey, and on the east side, you have Long Island, really Queens, and Brooklyn. Today, New Jersey drivers already pay to enter into Manhattan. You have to pay at the tunnel. You have to pay at the George Washington Bridge. Any tunnel you have to pay. It's upwards of $15 each way or one way in some cases, the Verrazano included. That already happens today. Yes, it's on different infrastructure. That infrastructure is largely owned by the Port Authority, but the point is you're already paying to come into Manhattan. On the east side now, right, which is Queens, Brooklyn from Long Island, you're only paying at some of the points. So if you take the Midtown Tunnel, you're paying. If you take the Triborough Bridge and come up and over, you're paying. But the Williamsburg Bridge is free. The Brooklyn Bridge is free, and the Manhattan Bridge is free. So today, it's actually already unequal. And so I think it's important for listeners who live in New Jersey, but who live elsewhere to really understand that. And so congestion pricing also provides an opportunity for more people to pay into the system because we're getting the same benefit. The other thing that I would turn around as part of the answer is how exactly are we defining benefit? So it might feel like, hey, if I paid this $9, what do I get back if I live in New Jersey or Connecticut? You get back this. You get back a stronger, healthier, public transportation system for the region. It is without question that the MTA system is the sole reason for the economic development of the tri-state area. It would not develop this way if the system did not exist and was not functional, dependable, and as sustainable. So many of us can be thankful for our employment where it is, what it is. Many of us can be thankful for where we live, how we live, the quality of life, the cultural resources we have access to, type of medical care that we have access to, the type of leisure and enjoyment and tourism that we have access to. Many of us can attribute that to the health and sustainability of the MTA system. And I also want to remind people that the MTA system, at least the subway, well, also buses too, is a 24/7 system that is not commonplace around the world. And that I think is something that many of us take for granted, especially if we aren't folks who are riding the train maybe at 4 in the morning. But there are many folks whose livelihood depend on the ability to navigate and perhaps what we would define as off hours. So everyone in this region, and other things I can throw in there too, right? Like Wall Street is here. As part of the finance and fire industry is here, and fire is what finance, insurance, and real estate, right? Like all of those are generators. You have life sciences. I already mentioned healthcare. You have huge educational resources. All of those things contribute. You have cultural resources and a history of all the museums, right? Like all those things contribute to a better quality of life for the people in this region. So it is not true that you would not benefit if you are coming from someplace outside of New York State. It is absolutely true that you would receive the benefit of a healthier public transportation system.
I don't have anything to add to that. I think that that was said phenomenally well, and I agree 100%. So
Thank you.
we'll just go to the next question on that one.
Great.
Um, on the region, another major transportation planning effort happening in the region is the Gateway Program. For those who are not familiar at a high level, it's a series of rail infrastructure improvements for lines that run from North Jersey, so Newark, Jersey City, Secaucus, my old stomping grounds, to New York City across the Hudson River. The Regional Plan Association has called this project critical to the growth of the region, probably to the same of the points that you just talked about, all of the economic engines and drivers. In what ways are the Gateway Program and congestion pricing related? If you could imagine for our listeners kind of the metropolitan area that has all of the gateway projects completed, has congestion pricing implemented. How is the region stronger or better economically, environmentally, and socially?
The easiest way for your listeners to understand is that both of those projects are dedicated investments in public transportation infrastructure. That's the best way to answer that question. You're right. Gateway is a series of projects, ultimately culminating in a regional benefit, that's really taking people back and forth from New York and New Jersey. So why is this important? It's important because actually of access to housing and a different quality of life for some folks. And we haven't really touched on that too much because we're mostly talking about transportation in this episode. But many parts of the region are not building the appropriate level of housing that we really need to house everybody. And especially not at an affordable level, and not at a pace that we need. Some parts of the region are, though. One of those parts is specifically northern New Jersey. And so that's just one example of why we would need a program like that, the Gateway program, to be built out, because we don't just need people to work here in the tri-state area. We also want people to live here and have different levels of good quality of life, depending on how folks want to define that for themselves. Also, as we talked a little bit about earlier, we need to be thinking about different ways to get around so that we can alleviate the vehicular traffic on the regional roadways. And so if that eases up space for freight by truck to move a little bit more efficiently, again, in conjunction with other things like maybe a transformation to hybrid or electric vehicles, or maybe moving goods by water as well. All those things work together as a system. And so it's really important for folks to think about them as pieces of one big puzzle, even if they're talked about in very siloed ways. Congestion pricing is the same thing. We're talking about dedicated, predictable, which is important, dedicated, predictable funding for capital improvement, right? And as we talked about that earlier, those are the things like building larger stations, buying better and more efficient infrastructure, cleaner infrastructure, having a more efficient system, making a system more accessible so that more people can get to and from work, home, school, medical appointments, and they can also contribute to the regional's economic sustainability.
Going back home to Jersey, the Northeast Corridor is like the most populous, most ridden train line in on New Jersey Transit. Runs
Hmm.
from Trenton to New York Penn Station, and every little node. As I was growing up, those transit nodes around those suburban train stations were not very active. Like sometimes the downtown would be circled around it, but they didn't really have a whole lot of housing. To your point, and today, as I'm riding the train and driving through those areas, Elizabeth,
Hmm.
Cranford,
Hmm.
Westfield, it's like it's so great to see. It's wonderful to see. And some of them have affordability requirements because of New
Hmm.
Jersey's Fair Share program. So it's wonderful to see like 200, 300 units of housing being built immediately adjacent to a train station
Yep.
that was previously a parking lot or like a single story retail deli or bakery or something. It is fantastic. There's so much more work to be done, but I can physically see the changes.
Hmm.
And I know our population is swelling. And I think in one of the RPA reports I was reading, the growth of the region, a lot of it is happening in New Jersey and like
Correct.
development population growth is growing in Northeast New Jersey. And it's part of that growth for New York City's area also.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so, as we wind down in the conversation, I'll take a more broader perspective. What do you see as the top challenges facing cities over the next decade? And how is the New York City metropolitan area positioned to overcome those challenges? Where does the region have some room for improvement?
I definitely think we just talked about one of them. It's housing. And it's not just giving people shelter, it's giving people affordable shelter, it's giving people a diversity of what that shelter looks like. Maybe my needs at age 16 are very different from my needs at age 65. And we need to think about that. I think another challenge for sure we talked about earlier is climate change. I think unfortunately this region is learning more of a lesson of the impact of intense weather events than perhaps people in other parts of the country have been used to for decades. I remember during Superstorm Sandy, when I was seeing pictures of people's houses being flooded in Staten Island. That's something I've never seen before. We later had a storm a couple years ago. I think it might have been Ira. I can't remember which one, but the rain came in so fast that people died in their basements. The basements flooded so fast in parts of like Queens. Who dies in their basement in Queens, right? And so these are tragic stories, unfortunately, but it is teaching us a lesson that we have to contend with the impact of climate change much sooner than we are acting, and we have to get out of the way. I think also the switch to more sustainable fuels and more sustainable energy, it is much more of a challenge here than I think many people realize. It's not just about educating people about hybrid and electric options for things, both on the passenger and freight side, but it's how fast we can actually implement those things. What does offshore wind really look like here? What does connecting it to the grid look like? What is the health of our grid? Those are answers that you need a couple other podcasts to talk about. And the picture is bleak in some instances. And so the metropolitan area is definitely, in a couple of ways, I think making strides in those directions. But we also have a long way to go in other ways. As much as we have, important legislation in place to theoretically get us towards more climate-friendly goals, some of the money that's been spent from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, some of that money is still going to more traditional transportation projects like highway widenings. And so that means that there is, something is not balanced. We can't, on one end, say we want to get to our climate goals that are fast approaching, and on the other hand, spend our money the same way that we have in the past. So there's lots of existential crises. You could pick any one of what I just mentioned, but there's definitely room for improvement in all of them.
Definitely. The infrastructure, climate change, housing, I would say those are top for me also as I think about challenges impacting cities. Tiffany, thank you so very much for coming on the 4 Degrees to the Streets podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you today. Not only just about congestion pricing, but about New York City and its history and development and growth. I really appreciate your knowledge and your insight that you shared with us. I will have links to all of the RPA's kind of social media in the show notes, but you can go to rpa.org. They're at Regional Plan on X and regional_plan on Instagram. And you can download episodes of the 4 Degrees to the Street podcast once a month, wherever you get your podcasts. Peace out, y'all. The episode you just heard was recorded in 2024, before congestion pricing was set to take place in January 2025, and before the Trump administration proposed changes to congestion pricing. I will now read the RPA's press release on that matter. February 19th, 2025, news release. RPA statement on Trump administration plan to revoke congestion pricing. The following statement is attributable to Kate Selvin, Executive Vice President of Regional Plan Association. Congestion pricing is a meticulously studied, globally proven program that is enshrined in New York state law. It is already delivering real-time benefits to New Yorkers. In just the first month since the program's implementation, the primary benefit of the program is traffic reduction. New Yorkers are already seeing faster commutes, less traffic, and increased safety on streets, with a 51% drop in crash-related injuries. With nearly 8% fewer cars on the road, commute times have reduced dramatically, having decreased by upwards of 48% during peak commute hours. These improved conditions support local businesses and create a thriving environment for local community members, commuters, and visitors alike. Congestion pricing of traffic congestion supports local businesses, not the other way around. A fully invested in MTA system will also mean increased efficiency, reliability, cleanliness, and safety for millions. This hasty obstruction through the rescinding of the federal approval of the VPPP for congestion pricing program threatens the long-term vitality of the tri-state region's $2 trillion economy and undercuts the shared benefits tri-state residents and commuters deserve. We remain committed to safeguarding this policy so it can continue to improve quality of life for both commuters and residents alike. End statement.